Finally, campaigns and elections. A very important subject that I feel like maybe I gave some short shrift by putting it at the very end of class. But really, it's a very fascinating subject that does get a ton of attention in the political science literature, as it rightly should. Because at the end of the day, right, this goes all the way back to the stuff at the beginning of the semester that we talked about with Mayhew, right? That political actors seek utility through expanding their coalitions of power. And how do they operationalize that? How do they manifest that? That is through winning elections, right? Politics is doing and winning, going all the way back to the first lecture. So let's talk about something much less exciting. Let's talk about Abramowitz here. Abramowitz and Webster, they're talking about electoral changes in recent elections, circa 2013, but it's still relevant today. What is their main theory that they're talking about here? What's the main crux of what they're talking about? Basically, voters increasingly define their party preference not because they're like, oh yeah, I love Democrats, I'm going to vote Democrat forever, but because they're like, I really can't stand Republicans, or I really can't stand Democrats. That's what negative partisanship is. Instead of being like, oh, I really like what these people stand for. It's not so much, I like what these people stand for, it's I dislike what those people stand for. So what does this mean in terms of outcomes, right? What does this mean for the ballot, right? What does this mean behaviorally for the voter? Yeah, it destroys nuance, and it drives record levels of straight ticket voting. I despise that South Carolina has an option on their ballot where you can just be like, check Democrats, check Republicans, because it forces people not to read the names of these people that they will never think about again, and think about what party they're a part of, right? And think about their platform, right? It basically allows people to say, if I hate all Republicans, then I guess I'm just going to vote all Democrat. And you think, well, this might be kind of the opposite of what we'd expect, right? If people are really passionate, positive partisans, then shouldn't they be more likely to vote straight ticket versus people who are negative partisans? Well, remember what we were talking about effective polarization and fear and anger being much stronger drivers of behavior in politics than good feelings and flowers and sunshine, right? People latch onto fear and anger, and if they make you fearful and angry, you are not going to let them into office. The other thing, too, that they find here that's interesting is independents who lean one way, right? So on a traditional political scale, if I get my markers out here, it wouldn't be a day of class unless I tried to find open space on this board to write something. So if you have a traditional political spectrum where you have I'm a strong Democrat and I'm a strong Republican, and then in the middle here you have the mythical unicorn creature that is the moderate or the true independent, right? Then in this space here you have lean Republican, and in this space here you have lean Democrat. What they're saying is you would expect these people to behave perhaps more like these people, right? They are persuadable in some way. But what Abramowitz and Webster are finding is, oh no, what basically matters is if you are this much over the line of center, that is how you vote. And if you are this much over the line of center, that is how you vote, right? Leaning independents just act as committed partisans now. What other factors are at play here? How does nationalization of politics factor into this? We talked about nationalization a month ago. Politics, because of negative partisanship, is becoming increasingly nationalized, which has a few effects. First, it weakens incumbency advantages. Remember when we talked about incumbency advantages, right? If you're an incumbent, as in you already serve in office, you have a lot of benefits. Fundraising, name recognition, and the like. Nationalization does weaken incumbency advantage, but also increases alignment with presidential vote patterns. This is kind of the massive split that we're seeing in the Republican Party right now, where people have been in the Republican Party at the national level going along largely with the Trump administration's agenda, but they are coming across roadblocks now where they're like, oh, this is really unpopular for me to vote for, and I need to preserve myself here. So maybe we might talk about negotiating Medicare or the expansion of the Obamacare tax credits. Maybe we're going to investigate you for potential war crimes because, Americans don't really like intervention in foreign wars. That's kind of blasé now. We are past that. So let's talk about campaigns and elections. Two distinct things that are inexplicably related. We're going to talk about how candidates emerge, how voters respond to those candidates, what strategies campaigns use, and how institutional structures shape the outcomes of elections. We're going to draw on a lot of the literature that is classic, as well as some of the contemporary findings in political science to understand why campaigns matter, when they don't, because a campaign doesn't always matter, and how recent trends in polarization, emotional appeals, and elite coordination have reshaped campaigning in the United States. I want to kind of transition your view of campaigns from like chaotic media spectacles in which you have like these sound bites, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, that like latch on into something that is much more strategic, even things like that, embedded in institutions and voter psychology. Okay? Remember, everything in politics, you might not notice it, but your brain does. So let's start with why campaigns matter. Well, campaigns help voters connect preferences with candidates. You have, perhaps, ideas. I don't know if you do. I'd like to think you do. About how the world should work and how your life should happen. And often the government dips their little toes in your life and, swishes around the water and changes it. And you want to have influence on that. So it helps people connect like, hey, I maybe don't want the government taking so much of my money in taxes, to a candidate who says, hey, maybe taxes aren't that good of a thing and we're going to lessen them. Campaigns also are helpful to ideally provide information. They show issue positions, candidate competency, and also identity cues from candidates. Remember that thing we talked about, responsible parties? In an ideal world, a campaign under a responsible party system would all be issue positions. This is where I stand on an issue, and you should vote for me because of that. When in reality, candidates are people. And so, we're going to vote on someone not just because they have certain policy ideas, but also like there's the kind of heuristic, like, would I want to have a beer with this guy? Or do they seem on the level, right? There are many off-putting things about many candidates to varying degrees, right? And it's kind of like this balancing act. What can I overlook to because I agree with their policies, and what is not overlookable because it is so egregious or so deeply embarrassing? And finally, this is an important note, the modern campaign really focuses on mobilizing supporters, donors, and activists. Most of modern campaigning, because elections are won on the margins, as in to get that 51% that you need, or the bare minimum electoral college votes you need, is just get out the vote. If your voters aren't excited about voting for you, the risk isn't that they're going to vote for the other guy, the risk is they're going to stay home. And so your goal is to make sure that your people come out to vote for you, and the other people don't come out to vote for the other guy. It's not about persuasion, it's about mobilization more now. So let's talk about campaign fundamentals. Campaign fundamentals, we're going to pull from these two scholars, Andrew Gelman and Gary King. Their work demonstrates that polls fluctuate during campaigns. A poll during a campaign is like, we're going to go do a random survey of American voters. Where do they stand? Is Donald Trump up by X points, or is Kamala Harris up by X points in the popular vote? And the like. They find that while polls fluctuate during campaigns, final vote shares align with long-term predictors. Basically, I don't trust pollsters. They do some kind of magic with their numbers, And basically since 2016, they've been always wrong. You should not trust pollsters either. There are a lot of problems with sampling error. There's a lot of problems with who's paid for the polls. Polls are helpful indicators. Everybody looks at them, but also everybody recognizes that they're kind of dog shit. So these long-term predictors that Gelman and King point out are these fundamentals: the economy, partisanship, and incumbency, right? Is the economy good? Well, they might reward the guy who's currently in office or the party that's currently in office. If the economy is bad, like it was under Biden, and he doesn't talk about the economy in his campaign, and then Kamala Harris proceeds to not talk about the economy in her campaign, maybe people who are struggling economically are going to have a problem with that. Campaigns often clarify and reinforce existing voter preferences. So, like, if I already think that, Kamala Harris has a weird laugh and is off-putting and might be a radical socialist out left, and then I see her show up on, what was that podcast that she did with that lady, right? That was in response to Donald Trump doing Joe Rogan. Clearly, I don't watch this podcast with Alex something. Anyway, Call Her Daddy. That's the podcast that she did. So if I see Kamala Harris on Call Her Daddy, right, and she's laughing weird and talks about like left-wing policies, and that clarifies to me that like maybe I don't want to vote for her. And polls shift early, but stabilize as voters receive more information. Basically, as more people get in the electorate and more people get information, they kind of calcify in what they want. So this is a big balance here. Mobilization versus persuasion. Polarized environments reduce persuadable voters. What I mean by that is if you have a bunch of staunch Republicans over here and a bunch of staunch Democrats over here, it is highly unlikely that you're going to be able to persuade these staunch Republicans to vote for a Democratic candidate. I think that this is becoming a little bit more of an outdated notion of politics as we move into the late 2020s here. This basically defined 2010s and early 2020s politics, but as we are moving away from kind of this left-right dimension of politics to a more orthogonal dimension, as in one that goes this way, right, between economic elites and economic populists, right, our politics is shifting a little bit away from it. But still, in polarized environments, persuadable voters are few and far between. Remember, the median or true independent voter is this mythical unicorn of a figure, right? So that leaves mobilization rather than persuasion as a strategy to pursue. You got to get your guys out there. You do this through targeted outreach. You reach out to, if you are running on like a pro-labor leftist platform, you're going to reach out to your labor unions because you already know that they are on your side. If you are a Democrat, you're going to reach out to pro-women groups like Emily's List and the like. If you are a Republican, you're going to reach out to the Heritage Foundation, have them organize stuff for you. You're going to reach out to the Koch brothers for money. You're going to do all of these things. You're going to reach out to these targeted groups that already have networks of mobilization. And then with everybody else, you're going to use emotional appeals. A lot has been said about the campaign ad during the 2024 election that was like, Donald Trump is for you, Kamala Harris is for they, them, where they kind of vilified trans people a lot. And I don't think that it was as effective of an ad as a lot of people say it is, but I do think that it is a really quintessential example of funding on the back end. That's what Donald Trump is doing right there. And then using emotional appeals for everybody else, right? Because that is a very emotional argument that he's making. This is a relic of 2020, people doing a get out the vote fundraising thing on a Zoom call. There's this kind of archaic notion of the invisible primary. You might have heard of the smoke-filled room. This idea that in olden days, there were a bunch of old dudes with mustaches and top hats and pipes and cigars and whiskey in a room that chose the candidate to run for office, and then they got together again and chose which one of those candidates would win. And that was largely how politics worked in the olden days in politics, but the invisible primary is still a thing today, largely in presidential elections. These are kind of the pipeline to office. Early endorsements, the networks that candidates create, and funding shape viability. If a candidate can't raise money, then they're not going to have the backing of their national committee. If they're not already in the national committee, they're not going to have the backing of that network. If they don't have that network, they're not going to get any early endorsements, right? Democrats want to get Barack Obama's endorsement. Regardless of what your parents might think about Barack Obama, or even if you guys probably barely remember his administration, right? Barack Obama is still a massively popular figure in the Democratic Party, especially among certain groups that then voted Trump afterwards. Party coalitions coordinate support before public voting. I basically already said that. And despite reforms, elites still influence candidate emergence. Remember, it's very expensive to run for office. You got to know the right people. You got to be in the right circles. That's why you don't usually see random Joes get to the top of political office. So let's talk about candidate emergence. How does a candidate emerge? Yes, you look confused. This is a picture of Zoran Mamdani in a music video that he made in a food truck about how much he loves his grandma's cooking. It's a rap. You can look it up. And yes, he is wearing no shirt and an apron. This was more recent than you would like to believe for the current largest Democrat on the national stage. So running for office requires a few things. One, you got to be ambitious. You got to get out there, kid. If you don't have goals, what are you doing? Two, you got to have resources. You got to have money or charisma or something that's going to get you out there. To get money, again, you need money. And you need social encouragement. If you are a candidate who comes out and you already have like a swath of like sex scandals, people aren't going to be like, you should run for our party. They're probably going to be like, hey man, I don't want to be seen with you because it's bad for my image. Caveat, when I say a lot of these things, Donald Trump is like kind of the exception. He seems to be able to get away with most anything. Women and racial minorities face structural and social barriers. I'm not just saying that because we had a week on intersectionality and racial and ethnic politics. Quite literally, the pipelines to office. So like think about this as like most people who run for state office, which is like the first step in, are lawyers and professionals in lobbying groups, right? And there are just fewer women in those positions. Then they become fewer women in state office, which then means fewer women in statewide office, which means fewer women in federal office, and so on and so forth. They're underrepresented in the pipeline to office. They also just kind of often lack resources and social encouragement. Perceived qualifications in recruitment strongly predict who runs. The Maine Senate primary for the Democratic office. Is anyone in here a Mainer from Maine? Oh, too bad. Maine has fascinating politics. They're weird up there. So Susan Collins, who's a Republican, she is seen as a very gettable seat in 2026. For Democrats, she is a Republican, and Democrats are trying to unseat her. So there is a massive primary race right now. One of the candidates running for office is named Graham Plattner. He currently has a few scandals about potentially having like a Nazi tattoo. Just weird shit. And so Chuck Schumer handpicked a candidate to run against him that also is wholly unpopular because she's the former governor of Maine and old as dirt. But she has high perceived qualifications. Yes? No, he's from New York. He is the leader of the Democratic Party right now. The leader of your party is either the president, or if you are out of power, it is the ranking members in the houses of Congress. So the leaders of the Democratic Party right now are Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries. And so they have large sway over things. So primaries exist. Primaries are weird. Primaries are kind of dumb how we do them in America. Other countries, they just announce an election, you have like 2 weeks to get your shit together. In America, you have so much time. So primary electorates are more ideological than general electorates. What I mean is not everybody votes in a primary, and the people who vote in the primary are diehard supporters of that party, usually, right? So the people who win primaries are usually more ideologically extreme than a candidate might be in the general election, right? People will talk about moderating in a general election. Again, we don't see that so much anymore, but it is common for a candidate in a primary to run very far left or very far right, and then when they get to the general electorate and they're trying to persuade independents, they start kind of moderating their opinions towards the center. However, extreme nominees face electoral primaries in competitive districts because often purple districts like the idea that they're purple. They want to seem independent, and they want their candidate, whether that is a Republican who wins or Democrat who wins, to be a true moderate. That's how you get someone like Susan Collins in office, who is, in Maine, very weird, right? She's a Republican, but she's also like the furthest left Republican in the Senate, which means that she's like a Republican. Safe seats amplify extremism rather than moderate candidates. If your seat is safe, you know they're going to vote for a Republican. You can say whatever the hell you want if you're a Republican. Same thing with Democrats. So messaging is super important in campaign strategy. Campaigns craft messages based on voter blocks and institutional context. Barack Obama is excellent at this, right? You're coming out of the 2008 recession, and what do you get when you see, John McCain running? He is the Republican nominee, if you don't know. He's talking about doom and gloom and taking kind of this foreign view of things, more of an international foreign policy view of things. And Barack Obama comes in with a message of hope, right? That's something you want to latch on to. It's the same playbook that Ronald Reagan uses coming out of the 1970s. It's mourning in America, right? What else do you get? Change, progress. We're moving forward into the 21st century, and that's something that you can glom onto. Issue ownership guides which topics candidates emphasize. Issue ownership is like really important, and it's intrinsically linked to qualifications. So let's take Barack Obama as an example when we're talking about this. Barack Obama was a freshman senator when he runs for president. Most people don't know that, but he was the new kid on the block, right? People see him as this establishment figure now, but he was new blood in the system. And while people thought that he had bona fides for economics, maybe urban planning and the like coming out of Chicago, he doesn't have a lot on the foreign stage. We're in the late 2000s, the war on terror is not going so well, and you need someone who has bona fides in there. So who does he bring on as his VP? One of the senators who is most respected for his foreign relations experiences, Joseph Biden. So he brings Biden on and allows them to have a more holistic issue ownership as a pair. Emotional appeals shape attention, recall, and motivation. A simple message, like hope, will stick in your head a lot easier than a complicated one. What was Kamala Harris's electoral strategy? Like, what was her slogan or something? I mean, yeah, there was the brat thing or whatever, but like, I can't think of it. MAGA, that just like sticks with you. Donald Trump didn't invent it. He also stole that from Ronald Reagan, as every successful politician has. But it still sticks with you, right? America first. It sticks with you. Battle for the soul of America, even Joe Biden's thing. That's exciting. So let's talk about emotions in campaigns. This is a picture, if you are not aware, of a meeting that House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who is a Democrat, had with Donald Trump, in which, to troll him, the Trump administration put out hats that said Trump 2028 on it. Not very professional, but I guess a funny meme. He seems to be enjoying himself. Hakeem Jeffries does not seem to be enjoying himself. Fear disrupts habits and increases information seeking. If you're like, hey guys, the world's gonna end, comes from like a plausible source or something like that, then maybe you're going to look into that a little bit more, either because you're like, nah, the world's not going to end, or you're like, holy shit, what can I do to stop the world from ending? Enthusiasm reinforces existing preferences and boosts turnout. The more enthusiastic a voter base is, the more ideally motivated they will be to mobilize. Emotion interacts with identity and political sophistication. Okay, different things going on here. So you have emotions: fear, anger, hate, happiness, joy, hope. They interact with your identity. So your identity conditions those. If you are a downtrodden minority who is poor and you believe that nobody is going to help your situation because politics never helps your situation, you might not have a lot of those positive emotions. So it's conditioning how receptive you are to a message like from someone like Barack Obama, who comes and says hope and the like, right? And political sophistication. Political sophistication, if you remember from our readings a little while ago, I know I assigned this one, is how information knowledgeable you are about politics, how much you know about politics. So, right, you are a poor individual who's minoritized, you are maybe not receptive to positive messages because you don't think anyone's speaking to you, and maybe you just want to be angry or upset, and maybe you are low information. So when someone like Donald Trump comes to you and says that immigrants are taking your jobs and it's their fault that you're suffering instead of wealth concentration or something like that, you are more likely to glom on to that than something else. I'm not saying this to cast aspersion on Trump voters. This is just what the political science says about particularly his 2016 swing of voters from Barack Obama voters to Trump voters. He took a disenfranchised, kind of poor, largely white electorate and stole them away. So let's talk about negative campaigning. Negative campaign ads provide diagnostic information to voters. That's a very nice way of saying they're really good at pointing out all of the flaws in the other person and scaring the shit out of you. This is a classic campaign ad. You might have seen it in high school that Lyndon Baines Johnson ran against the Republican Barry Goldwater when Lyndon Baines Johnson was seeking re-election, in which you have a little girl who has a little daisy and does the little daisy thing where she's like counting down the little petals as she's ripping them off. And then as she's ripping them off, you start to hear like a countdown from a man in the background. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. And then they cut to a nuclear bomb going off. And like the little, like in the girl's eye, like they zoom in on her and then, and then it literally just says, vote for LBJ, you can't afford not to. Because the idea is if you vote for Barry Goldwater, he's going to get us into a nuclear war, because Barry Goldwater at the time was seen as a warmonger and a foreign interventionist in a very bad way. Voters, however, they're savvy. More savvy than I give them credit for. They distinguish between civil and uncivil negativity, and they respond differently to those. So if a negative ad is like, this person's ugly, I bet that they, don't have any friends, and I bet their spouse cheats on them, and they're just terrible, and bleh. Voters aren't going to respond to that like in the same way, because people still have like this air where they view themselves as respectable, even if they are of the same slop that the rest of us are, right? And they respond to that differently than if someone's like, so-and-so is corrupt, and we're looking out for your interests. That's much more civil and, easier to respond to. Relevant attacks can improve decision-making rather than harm it. So notice this emotional appeal here, this LBJ ad. It is really relevant to people because there is nothing that people are more scared of in the late 1960s than nuclear Armageddon. It's everywhere. The Cold War is a terrible thing. You can actually see like the ramifications of the Cold War in everyday life in Columbia here. If you notice on Taylor Street, where it intersects with Main, on the side of the ballet studio there's a mural that's like the glass window reflection of a building next to it. And in that reflection, it's actually of the Sheraton Hotel, which is a weird situation to put it over here. You can see they painted in the old bomb shelter, the nuclear bomb shelter sign on the wall there that used to be there. So let's talk about institutions here, because institutions shape behavior. It's a big thing here. Single-member plurality districts encourage two-party competition. Basically, and we've talked about this a little bit. We talked about first-past-the-post voting. We talked about ranked choice voting back when Zoran Mamdani won the Democratic primary. But single-member districts, where you have one person representing one district, it encourages a two-party system. There's not a lot of room for different parties to get in there because you don't have like second place taking one of the seats. Winner-take-all primaries also amplify factionalism, right? In a ranked choice primary, like New York's primary, it allows people to kind of show what their policy preferences are, right? So if Zoran Mamdani had not won such an overwhelming victory in the Democratic primary, but he still did win, it might have been a signal that he needed to moderate his positions to be more akin to his opponents, like Andrew Cuomo. And midterms systematically penalize the president's party. This is really important coming into 2026. It is an American tradition, as rich as hot dogs and apple pie on the 4th of July, that every 2 years after a presidential election where we have a new party in, Americans decide, hey, I regret what I bought here, I'm going to vote the other people in, and then just give themselves gridlock for 2 years. So basically, it is a strong expectation that in the 2026 midterms, if the gerrymandering schemes don't have a massive impact on the House or the Senate, that Democrats should take at least one of the houses of Congress, right? And in the same way that Republicans took Congress in 2022, in the same way Democrats took Congress in 2018, in the same way we saw flip-flopping in the second Obama administration. The first one was weird, because in 2008 you vote in Barack Obama, and people are still giving him grace in the economy in 2010, and Republicans are still super unpopular because everybody hated George W. Bush. And then they also vote Democrats in, but you get the idea. After we vote in a person of a new party, we vote in the other party into Congress. This is just a map of electoral college votes that I think is out of date, but that's neither here nor there. Do elections realign coalitions? Do elections matter at scale? Sure, they matter from election to election, who is in office, but do they matter, like, do things change within each election cycle? Well, there's this theory, it's called realignment theory, bless you, that comes out of the 20th century that our friend David Mayhew actually disputes a little bit, that there are like pivotal elections, right? Ronald Reagan's first election, it's a pivotal election in which you have a whole new coalition supporting the Republican Party. The Reagan Revolution, I kind of buy that a little bit in his case, right? Ronald Reagan had the three-legged stool of the Republican Party, which was like corporatists, economic conservatives, foreign interventionists, and evangelical Christians, right? That he remade the Republican coalition around that group. David Mayhew's like, no, this happens slowly over time, which like might track too. We have NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that passes under Bill Clinton. And sure, everybody is a free trader in the 90s, everybody supports neoliberal economics. And then in the 2000s, we start to see middle America and the Rust Belt start to like decline a little bit more. And sure, maybe the 2008 recession happens and we give Barack Obama a try in these union towns, but people are still disgruntled. And by 2016, these poor former union workers who used to vote Democrat, who are largely white, are so upset with it, they're going to vote for Donald Trump, right? It's a slow thing that boils up over time. Basically, evidence for stable cycles is weak and inconsistent, that like every few years we reinvent the cycles. Incremental change better explains long-term shifts in electoral coalitions. So what are your big takeaways here? One, campaigns matter, but the fundamentals of campaigns, remember what those fundamentals are, they're on a slide earlier, there's definitely a question in the question bank about them. They shape outcomes. Modern campaigns prioritize mobilization over persuasion. Institutions, identity, emotion, and elite networks structure elections. And finally, campaign effects operate through information, emotion, and turnout, all interchangeably. What you know matters, how you feel about it matters, and whether what you feel about that information gets you out the door to actually cast a ballot is the ultimate realization of that mattering.